Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the US-Asia Law Institute at NYU School of Law. This is the fourth and final panel of our 2022 Timothy A. Gillott Dialogue on Rule of Law in East Asia, with the theme of climate change in Asia Pacific. And tonight's panel is about corporate governance and climate change. First, a couple of preliminary announcements. I want to give a quick promo for our next webinar, which is 1 week from today on Wednesday, April 6th, but at 9 a.m., which is our usual time. I will be talking with Maria Adele Karai and Hong Zhang about China's Belt and Road Initiative. And also, I want to thank the Apex Study Center of Columbia University, which has been a co-sponsor of this year's Gillott Dialogue, including tonight's program. We appreciate their support. And now I'm going to hand the mic to Bruce Aronson, who is a resident affiliate scholar of the US-Asia Law Institute and an expert on corporate governance in the US and Asia, and in fact is sitting on the board of a Japanese listed company, so he has firsthand experience as well as scholarly and experience as a practitioner. So Bruce.
Thank you, Catherine. Bruce Aronson, I'll be the moderator today. I should briefly note that on our website, there is a new symposium on the social role of corporations in Asia Pacific. It's a collection of essays in the Usali East-West Studies series that looks at the state of corporate ESG, environmental, social, and governance activities in 6 Asia Pacific jurisdictions. 3 of the essay authors have joined us as speakers today. They're a self-selected group in the sense that they all agreed to focus specifically on the question of climate change as a leading example of a pressing issue of corporate social responsibility in Asia Pacific. For today's panel, I'm delighted to welcome my knowledgeable colleagues, 2 of whom, Jennifer Hill and Umakanth Varottil, worked with me in producing a textbook on corporate governance in Asia. While the third colleague, Yumiko Miwa, has worked with me on a number of research projects and in addition serves together with me as an independent director on the board of a listed Japanese company. Jennifer Hill is the Bob Baxt AO Chair in Corporate and Commercial Law and the Director of the Center for Commercial Law and Regulatory Studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm also confident in saying that she is the leading legal expert on corporate governance in Australia. Umakanth Varottil is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, National University of Singapore, and correspondingly is the leading legal expert on corporate governance in India. He may also add a few comments about the situation in Singapore as he teaches in Singapore and US. Yumiko Miwa is a professor of finance at Meiji University. Corporate governance is a multidisciplinary field that includes law, finance, and other areas. So we're especially pleased to have her join us. I can report that her work on the role of institutional investors in corporate governance is very well known, even to us legal types. For additional information, their bios are on our website. Our program today is 90 minutes. We'll first hear brief presentations, 5 minutes or so from each of the panelists to highlight the characteristics of climate change policy and the social role of corporations in their jurisdictions. And we can bear those thoughts in mind as we proceed to a more general discussion. Our discussion will cover both general global issues and the specific situation in each of the countries represented today. And then we'll go on to the Q&A. I'd like to thank Catherine, who has finally agreed to participate today as the representative or voice of the audience. So send your questions by pressing the Q&A icon, and Catherine will present them to us. The chat function is not operating. As a very brief background, the genesis of our symposium online and this panel was a straightforward question from a colleague at the US-Asia Law Institute. And what is the hottest topic in corporate governance today throughout Asia? And to find out, I queried a group of my colleagues from 6 countries who had previously collaborated with me on a book on corporate governance in Asia. And the essentially unanimous answer was the social role of corporations as exemplified by ESG, the environmental, social, and governance factors that are related to a company's business activities, and particularly with respect to climate change. Or as one of the symposium essays, which I don't think is published online yet, put it quite succinctly, good corporate governance appears to be a key to a sustainable green future. This actually surprised me. My reaction was, really, the social role of corporations? That's a conversation that has been going on forever and is never resolved. It's typically only in the background when we discuss should companies focus on profits for shareholders in a narrow sense or benefits more broadly for stakeholders in society. In addition, I was surprised because for public policy issues in Asia like climate change, we generally think of the role of governments, not corporations. Needless to say, I deferred to the collective wisdom of my colleagues, and we therefore have today's interesting topic to contribute to the dialogue. If the environmental pledges of governments cannot achieve their goals under current policies, it will be essential for corporations to assume a large role. And I suppose that the current emphasis on the social role of corporations, on one hand, reflects the rapid rise of expectations of corporations for ESG, and also in turn is reflected in the explosion of investment funds that focus on ESG investment. As we will hear today, there are a number of problems in this area. ESG definitions are vague and inconsistent. There's always skepticism about corporate pronouncements about working for the good of society. Are they more public relations or are they actual commitments? We even have a new word for that, greenwashing. In addition, there's the question of corporate governance in Asia Pacific. It's a diverse region, but overall, historically, there's been a broader emphasis on stakeholders in society rather than narrowly on profits and shareholders, at least compared to the US. So will that translate smoothly into modern ESG type considerations, and how will that affect corporate social role in addressing climate change? So let's begin. Jennifer, can you start us off with your presentation?
I'd be delighted to, Bruce. And thank you so much, Bruce, Jessica, and Catherine, for having me on this terrific panel. My colleague from Monash, Dr. Tim Bowley, and I wrote the Australia piece for the project that Bruce is talking about, the social role of corporations in Asia Pacific. And we felt that Australia was really at a very important inflection point in this regard. Now, just a couple of notable features about Australia sitting within that Asia Pacific region. I think Australia is quite different to many other parts, certainly of East Asia. Firstly, it has a very distinctive market structure. So the OECD's 2021 Corporate Governance Fact Book says that Australia is the second least concentrated ownership after the US. In fact, I think that's a bit misleading. Australia really sits kind of in the middle of Asia's more concentrated ownership, blockholder ownership, and the dispersed ownership via institutional investors, a different form of concentrated ownership, but you know, the US on the other hand. And Australia has both you know, non-institutional blockholders and institutional investors, but with a high proportion of institutional investors, both local and international, in the top public companies. The second interesting thing I think about developments in Australia in this region or this area is the fact that governments are so absent. This truly is happening outside the government arena. It's happening in private enterprise and in market. And so I think there are three corporate governance pressure points that I just want to briefly touch on, and then we can delve into them further when we have the broader discussion. The first is corporate codes. And I find corporate codes quite interesting. I mean, corporate governance codes have been around for a long time. Stewardship, shareholder stewardship codes for a shorter period of time, but boy, have they taken off throughout Asia. in relation to corporate governance codes, Australia has recently rejigged its corporate governance code in 2019 and now has a number of provisions that deal especially with ESG matters and particularly with climate change. And even though the code is only on a comply or explain basis, nonetheless, it says that companies should make disclosures recommended by the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the ubiquitous TCFD. So Australia doesn't have mandatory disclosure of TCFD-aligned disclosures, unlike many other parts of Asia, such as New Zealand, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Some of those, they already have it, others it's coming in. But nonetheless, it's been very influential, and it is now regarded as the gold standard of disclosure. In relation to stewardship codes, Australia doesn't, unlike many other parts of Asia, have a national stewardship code, but it has two industry codes that are very influential. One of those codes barely ever mentions ESG matters, let alone climate change. The other puts it front and centre. What about institutional investor activism and stewardship in action, rather than just being on the books? Well, there's a lot of movement in that regard in Australia. Lots of shareholder questions at annual general meetings, a real barrage of questions about decarbonisation, for example, and also shareholder proposals trying to push companies to reduce carbon emissions. Secondly, growing support for those ESG-related shareholder proposals, both from Australian superannuation or pension funds, which are the 5th largest pension fund pool in the world, and also from large international institutional investors such as BlackRock. We also see the institutional investors collaborating and creating their own networks, such as the Climate League 2030, which is seeking deeper emission cuts for Australia. And Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England and currently UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, has said they hold tremendous clout to push change in this regard. Australian companies are also starting to put in so-called say on climate resolutions, and we might discuss that further in the panel discussion. The final way in which I think Australia is shifting is there is now significant recognition that Australian directors can be liable for breach of directors' duty, specifically the duty of care, if they fail to take into account the risks of climate change. And I know that that's something that's also being discussed in a number of other Asian jurisdictions. But, you know, I was at a conference yesterday. One of the speakers, a leading corporate law specialist in Australia, said there is no doubt that the duty of care now encompasses the duty to consider the financial risks posed by climate change. So I'll leave it there, Bruce, because I know we'll have a good period of time to discuss these matters in further detail in the panel discussion. But what I would say is I think there is broad recognition, certainly by the regulators in Australia and by the financial community, that climate change really is a first order risk for Australia's financial system. And there are a lot of different pressure points. We haven't come on one that's going to, solve all the problems, but everyone is looking for solutions. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Umakanth?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce and Catherine, for inviting me for this. And I'm glad to be sharing this discussion with Jennifer and Yumi. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the position in India and maybe make some references casually to Singapore and Hong Kong that me and my colleagues have been working with. So starting with India, the story is somewhat slightly different from what Jennifer painted in the context of Australia, because the government is very closely involved in the efforts as far as corporate governance is concerned in the Indian context. So climate risk is something that is pretty close to the Indian corporate sector, because India is one of the countries that's most affected by climate change. There are always stories about extreme weather events in India, such as heat waves, floods, irregular monsoons that Indian agriculture depends very heavily on. And physical risks are definitely well known in the Indian context. So, for example, one study shows that heat-exposed work constitutes about 50% of India's GDP and employs nearly 380 million people. So even a slight increase in temperature can affect about 75% of the workforce in India. So it's an existential issue, and the role of corporations takes on a very important component of this discussion. Of course, India is a party to the Paris Agreement and has made some commitments, which we will talk about a little later. There is some sense of disappointment because India's commitments are not as timely as some of the other countries have in this context. And the final point in the Indian context is India has a very activist judiciary as well. So there is a likelihood that investors could resort to the Indian judiciary, perhaps not under corporate law, but maybe under public law. And the judiciary tends to be quite active when it comes to issues of human rights, climate, environment, and so on. So in this background, I just want to mention 2 points relating to corporate governance and climate change in the Indian context. The first relates to the duties of directors under Indian corporate law. And the second is disclosure and reporting regime on ESG issues and climate change specifically. So it's very, very crucial when it comes to corporate governance and the role of the directors in dealing with climate risk. And universally, it's become well recognized today that regardless of things like ESG, corporate social responsibility, climate risk involves material financial implications on the company. So even if you don't have ESG and CSR, it's really something that hits the shareholders' pockets. And to that extent, it's important for companies to take that into account. And one very, very unique aspect of Indian law is that there is a specific provision under the Companies Act in India, which requires the directors of the company to act for the protection of the environment. So the environment has a specific mention in the directors' duties provision under company law. And to a large extent, this is unique because there is no such very absolute obligation that I have come across in other jurisdictions. And this clearly suggests that companies have to take into account climate risk and also the long-term interests of the company, because the protection of the environment commands its own space in what the directors have to do. And this is regardless of the financial implications that are involved. So this is something that, at least on paper, is a very, very significant recognition that climate risk is an important component of what boards should be doing and how corporate governance should be dealing with this. And of course, there's also the incidental obligation, which many other jurisdictions have, that directors have to act with reasonable care, skill, and diligence, which necessarily means that there needs to be systems and processes to identify and address climate risk. So the director's duty is one important component. And then there's this question of climate risk disclosure as well. So just before I complete the discussion on directors' duties, if I were to kind of also bear my other hat looking at Singapore and to some extent Hong Kong, there is no such explicit duty in those jurisdictions, because at least Singapore more or less still continues to be fairly shareholder oriented. But nevertheless, there is increasing understanding, at least among the industry and practitioners, that implicit in the director's duties is the fact that climate risk should be considered. So in the Indian context, you have something very, very specific and explicit, whereas in Singapore and Hong Kong, and one needs to look at how the jurisprudence is going to develop. But lawyers and legal opinions that have been issued in this regard seem to suggest that climate risk is very important. And one other thing that I will mention, and maybe I'll drop this in the chat after I finish my remarks, this body called Commonwealth Climate Law and Initiative, CCLI, which is based in London, has also been exercising this task of going around and getting legal opinions from different jurisdictions on what directors should be doing in relation to climate risk. And it's actually started off in Australia, and then now they've covered about almost 8 or 10 different countries. And these are very interesting opinions which deal with climate risk and what directors of companies ought to be doing, failing which the kind of liability that they would be exposed to. So coming to the second point on climate risk disclosure, again, this is a very, very important aspect of creating the necessary incentives for people to act in terms of dealing with climate risk, because the more you have to disclose, the more you have to come up with strategy and implement on how companies are going to deal with climate risk. And this has an important component of Indian securities regulation. And one very important component is that starting April 1st, that's like later this week, there's a new set of expanded what is called as business responsibility and sustainability reporting, BRSR, that is going to come into existence. And so starting financial year 2022, which starts on 2023, starts on April 1st, 2022, there's a new and expanded set of regulations for disclosure of ESG matters, and climate risk is an important component of that. So there needs to be greater disclosure. Again, Bruce mentioned about greenwashing and so on. I think we have to watch out for that. Just because there are new regulations, it doesn't mean that things are going to change overnight. But this is something that India has taken very seriously. But the only difference from what Jennifer also mentioned is India doesn't explicitly look to the TCFD regime. So there's going to be concerns about parity, comparability. You have different set of rules for different jurisdictions. How are we going to be able to compare companies across these jurisdictions? So I think that's really a concern. But if I were to move to Singapore and Hong Kong, as Jennifer also mentioned, I think it's very clear that Singapore and Hong Kong are gradually in the process of moving to a very clear TCFD regime. So I think Singapore and Hong Kong seem to be more internationally plugged into the system for some kind of a commonality in terms of the disclosure regime, whereas India seems to have taken the option of having its own disclosure regime rather than to plug into the international system. Eventually, I think there could be some potential convergence, but that's something to wait and watch. So I'll end with these two kind of key things about directors' duties and disclosures, and then we can certainly continue to discuss this as we move along.
Thank you. Yumi, you have some slides to share with us?
Yes, good morning and good evening, and thank you for having me, Bruce and Catherine. And can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, so Bruce and I wrote the rapid growth of ESG in Japan through government industry cooperation. And I'm not an expert, legal expert. So my presentation will be the relatively finance perspective from the relatively finance perspective. Okay. So Japan declared carbon neutrality by 2050 in 2020, and last year government announced GHG reduction target by 2030, aiming for 46% reduction compared to the fiscal year 2013. So green growth strategy is a government effort. So it consists of 5 parts. So I would like to speak the finance part and regulatory reform. It means the soft law to hard law. And this graph, I want to show how low the percentage of renewable energy in Japan and China. The green, blue and orange part is the renewable energy. So, as a corporate initiative to decarbonize is, as Jennifer said, we have TCFD regime. So in terms of disclosure, Japanese companies can be said that very good student, because TCFD sign up, the number of TCFD sign up companies are the ranked number 1 first in the world. So as a regulation, the effort for the sustainability have been strengthened through the reform to the corporate governance code and stewardship code. Last year, these codes are revised. So the company are required to disclose their path to decarbonization and to develop board oversight on ESG issues. Well, Jennifer said as Jennifer mentioned, these are the soft laws to comply or explain. However, most Japanese companies comply. We call it comply pressure. So I think the soft law in Japan works kind of as a semi-hard law. Well, this is due to the horizontal mindset of Japanese companies. And from this April, Tokyo Stock Exchange market reorganization will start. So the companies listed on the highest market, the prime market, will be required to disclose based on TCFD. This is mandatory. So Japan moving from soft law to hard law. And in addition, foreign investors have the big push on Japanese companies to go green, because foreign investors have more than 30% of shares of outstanding in Japan. So in Japan, relatively diverse stockholder structure push the companies to go green. So, okay, I will skip this slide. And this slide shows the left table shows the beneficial owners of Japanese companies. We can see the Nomura asset management company, the Nikko or Daiwa, very big Japanese asset management companies. They are entrusted to manage assets from European asset owners who are very sensitive to our environmental matters. So Japanese asset managers, companies have to report the status or decarbonization status of the companies in which they invest. So in addition, 2 years ago, 2020, for the first time, shareholder proposals related to climate risk were submitted to some Japanese companies. So last year we have 2 or 3 shareholder proposals. And since then, the Japanese asset management companies have the environmental related voting policy. Yeah. Like this shows the environmental related policies. So maybe we have more shareholder proposals this year, I think. So thus Japan pressure from the government and soft law to hard law and the institutional investors, not only like this BlackRock or Fidelity, but Japanese domestic investors tend to engage or vote on decarbonization of the companies. So these are the main power or pressure to accelerate the move toward carbon neutrality in Japan. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
you. So let's start a discussion, and we're not going to take turns or raise hands. We're just going to politely barge in and hopefully just talk to each other. So I don't know exactly where to start, but one thing that I've noticed is I think there's a perception that Asian countries generally lag behind the EU and the US with respect to both ESG in general and climate change issues in particular. And I've never fully understood whether that's true or what that's based on. Do people agree with that? What should we be looking at? How do we judge those things? In terms of kind of ESG assets under management, then the EU and the US are the largest, although Japan and Australia also are quite significant. We've already talked about disclosure with many Asian countries moving forward. So what do we think? A lot has changed in the last 2 years or so. Have people not kept up with what's going on in Asia, or are in fact Asian countries lagging behind in some sense? Go ahead, Jennifer.
I just say, Bruce, there is certainly that perception out there that Asia is a laggard. I sometimes wonder whether the perception that Asia is a laggard is due to the fact that Asia has been the dominant power in terms of economic development in the last decade, and that Asia's been much more focused on, the Asian tiger. Certainly when I speak to my colleagues who work in the area of sustainability, they see Australia very much as a laggard. I think everyone is a laggard behind Europe. Europe is the one that has really forged ahead in this area. And probably, the Scandinavian countries were at the forefront as well. And so I do think that there is, significant differences between jurisdictions in terms of where they're at and, whether they're going to have sustainability readiness going forward.
Okay. Yumi,
Yeah, I agree with Jennifer because EU has mandate rules to go green. So in terms of ESG asset balances, Asia, including Japan, lags behind EU and US. But as to Japan, the growth rate of ESG asset over the past few years has been very amazing. So, well, of course, we have to watch ESG washing, but the growth rate of ESG asset, in terms of growth rate in the ESG asset, we can say we can catch up. But anyway, we have the rules difference between the EU and Japan and Asia. So in that sense, we lags behind the EU.
Okay.
And Bruce, just to add, I think to a large extent, there's the international relations and international politics discussion, because, for example, I think countries like China and India have agreed to a net zero commitment at a country level, which is much later than what the European and the Western markets have done. And as Jennifer said, rightly so, because I think the argument from these countries is that economic development took place more recently, and more people need to be lifted out of poverty. So maybe to some extent, issues like climate risk have not been right at the forefront as in the Western markets. So that's, I think, on the international side of and the politics side of things. But if we come to the corporate side of things, I think the development, if we were to also compare it with corporate governance, usually Asia has played a catch up to the Western markets, but whenever the development has taken place, it's taken place very, very rapidly. So if you look at corporate governance broadly, I think that's been the case. So my sense is that I think the same thing is going to happen with ESG and climate. So the changes will happen really, really quickly in the Asian context, and the catch-up will, the difference in the or the gap will be narrowed pretty quickly, and we see that happening already in with disclosures and even duties and so on. So I think the regime will be there, but how fast the business is going to catch up, I think that's something to be seen yet.
So
yeah, Bruce, can I just follow on from Umakanth and Yumi's comments there? I agree that Asia is already changing, or East Asia. And, Yumi, you would know the Mizuho Financial Group. They in 2020 had, the first shareholder filing of a resolution, climate change, and it got 35% of votes. And the other thing I think is interesting, again, being driven by international institutions. So, a hedge fund coming out of England is the driver of this say on climate. And they've already put it in place and pressured a number of Australian mining companies to have these say on climate votes that are like say on pay, where the shareholders get a vote on, what do we think you're doing with climate? But they've also really said that they're very much focused on Asia. So, they're going to be going into Asia generally, and also the US.
Well, can I ask a question to Jennifer? Because you mentioned about the shareholder proposals on climate change risk. We have the binding proposals. So it's difficult to submit shareholder proposals because Japanese, the system is binding. So in Australia, it's a non-binding proposal for the companies.
Well, not exactly. Australia, goes with the traditional English approach that, some things are management's domain, some things are shareholder domain. But what has been happening in Australian companies is that there'll be sort of two resolutions piggybacked on top of one another. And one will be to alter the constitution, and then there'll be another resolution. And so the alteration of the constitution is shareholders are allowed to do that, and it's binding. That will often fail, but the piggybacked resolution will get heard. So yes, so it's sort of a backdoor method of getting the kind of non-binding resolutions or precatory resolutions that are available in the US that, Bruce would know a lot about.
Well, going back to Umakanth's comment for 1 second, just to be clear, so most countries have pledges of carbon neutrality by 2050. I guess that's the majority. But China is 2060.
2060.
Umakanth, is India also 2060?
Yeah, so at the COP26 in Glasgow, the Indian Prime Minister made a statement that it's going to be 2070. So you see there's like a 10-20 year gap. So I think that's really where we are.
Okay, well, Jennifer, in responding, I've been wondering, as people say Asia's lagging behind, I think most people would agree the EU has been leading. ESG assets in the US have been skyrocketing the last few years, and I think in terms of amount, although not in terms of percentage, are now higher than the EU. As you may have noticed, just last week, the SEC in the US made a new proposal for extensive mandatory climate related disclosures, but I expect that to be strongly opposed by industry and probably end up in litigation. So that brings me back to the question of lagging or ahead based on what? Would we agree that the EU has done a lot in terms of kind of EU-wide directives, and the US may be more, Umakanth mentioned the government role. Government role in the US has been rather small, and so whether by design or by circumstance, a lot of the lifting is being done by institutional investors who have enthusiastically embraced selling ESG funds to the public. So to the extent the US is making progress, it's from quite a different model than the EU model. And are they two extremes, or can we say that they both rely on the function of markets in some way? Where would the Asian models fit in if we think of one as government regulation and one as deferring to markets? Umakanth?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. And again, I think on this point, it seems to me that there's considerable variation among jurisdictions, even within Asia. So if you take the Indian example that I outlined a little earlier, a lot of it to start with has been government driven because the government has mandated certain things in statute. Although I think the industry is now catching up fairly clearly. But if you look at a market like Singapore, the government has some role to play, but it's indirect. It's not like a top-down approach, but the leading state-owned investor, which is Temasek, is actually leading by example. So it's not like the government says what needs to be done, but the investor, Temasek, has come out with its own statements and principles on how to deal with climate risk and ESG. So once they take the lead, the expectation is that other institutions will follow. So I suppose it really depends on which jurisdiction. I think we see both these examples playing out in different Asian jurisdictions.
So they're both tools, and neither one is a strict model that's followed exclusively.
Yeah.
But Bruce, I mean, it's absolutely right about the EU being this, complex juggernaut of directives. And indeed, I noticed that they've just, in February 2022, they have a proposal for a new directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. So it's sort of layer upon layer upon layer of directives in the EU.
Well, for the discussion in the US, I mean, I guess it boils down to, in some sense, how much are we willing to pay? How valuable is it to have the investors and the market be able to make apples to apples comparisons among different reporting companies on their climate risks? We talked about this TCDF, which is not mandatory in the US. So there are right now disclosures, companies that make disclosures, you all use all different metrics and frameworks, even within the same jurisdiction. So that might seem like an important matter. At the same time, though, the cost would be significant. And the United States being the society that it is, if the SEC puts in a new rule, we can expect a great deal of litigation for securities fraud for not disclosing properly. So this, the question that Umakanth raised among jurisdictions about eventually achieving a common standard of disclosure, I think is significant, but we're already experiencing that even just within the United States.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, absolute need for reliable metrics so that you can compare apples with apples, and so that, you know, other things such as executive remuneration, you know, it reverberates there. If you're going to, you know, change the way you assess remuneration to take into account these kind of social goals, you really have to know what you're measuring, and, you know, have an effective way to do it. And of course, Europe has, you know, basically has ESG matters embedded in executive remuneration to a massively greater degree than certainly the US and I suspect currently Australia, but that may change.
Oh, that would be an interesting development if we start a movement in that area.
As to the disclosure, as to the disclosure, instead of TCFD, so first our foundation started to uniform the global standard. So ISSB will make a prototype for the disclosure. So in the world, so many countries follow this movement, I think. So the disclosure uniform will be done soon. So we can easily evaluate companies in terms of remuneration. So, and that, I think the way goes that way.
Okay, well, that will certainly be an interesting development to keep looking at. But so one question I have, though, is, so even if the EU has lots of directives, if they focus primarily on disclosure, then aren't we still sort of relying on the market and investors to put pressure on companies to assume a more active role in combating climate change? You both your essays of Jennifer and Umakanth talked a bit about, quite a bit about directors' fiduciary duties, and you both mentioned that tonight. I'm not aware of any other jurisdictions in Asia that have gone as far on that. But but even leaving that aside for the moment, isn't the general thrust still disclosure and market reaction to try to move corporations forward? Or maybe not?
Yeah. So maybe if I can start, Jennifer, would you like to go or?
No, you start.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things, this is a very interesting question, Bruce. I think the question, ultimately, we have two different tools, one of directors' duties and another of disclosure. If you were to treat it as treat them as two different tools. Ultimately, the question is, how do you enforce both of these obligations? And if we go by the director's duties kind of scenario, then we need to have like a rich enforcement mechanisms. The courts need to be much more efficient. There needs to be like a mechanism that allows shareholders to bring suits to enforce these duties. And we see, a lot of this happens in the US because of the class action mechanism. There's a lot of private enforcement, but the same cannot be said of Asia. And interestingly, one of the new developments, which I just see on a comment as well, is the Client Earth, one of the NGOs, has decided to sue Shell in the UK under Section 172 of the UK Companies Act. So my own sense is, I think those things, I'll leave it to Jennifer to discuss the Australian position because I'm not very familiar. But if you look at countries like India, Singapore or Hong Kong, it's not going to be very easy to bring these derivative actions. There are a lot of guardrails, there are a lot of conditions that need to be satisfied. So I think you can have these directors' duties, but are shareholders going to be successful in enforcing? I think there's a big question mark. But that leaves us with the other tool, which is disclosure. And disclosure falls within the realm of public enforcement. So we're not relying so much on private shareholders to litigate. We're going to leave it largely to the securities regulator to bring these actions. And there, I think those are relatively more tried and tested. Of course, you can have criticisms about the securities regulators in each jurisdiction, but they already have mechanisms to deal with misdisclosures. And climate change is a specific type of disclosure that's been added to the bucket. So we're not asking for anything new. We're just asking for regulators to use the existing tools to start coming up with disclosures on climate change. So yes, we are leaving it to the market for disclosures, but the securities regulator need to enforce to ensure that the disclosures are actually true and accurate. To that extent, they also have a role to play. So one of my co-authors, Ernest Lim, and I, we've kind of looked at both of these, and we are a bit more sanguine about, at least in Singapore, Hong Kong, and India, more sanguine about the ability of the regulators to deal with disclosures more than shareholders being able to bring derivative actions and so on. So I think this public versus private enforcement story is different in at least these jurisdictions in Asia compared to the US, where I think there's a lot of reliance on private enforcement, except of course this new regulation of the SEC that's been proposed last week. I think that will increase the role of SEC as well to some extent. So we'll have to wait and see for that.
If it ever happens, we'll see.
Yeah, it's been the SEC, it's been so controversial going through when they were considering doing that. Yeah, if I can just say something on Australia, I think Australia is really interesting because it's a strong contrast to both your points, I think, Umakanth. In Australia, this issue came to the forefront as a result of two very prominent barristers, one of which is possibly my oldest friend from law school, Noel Hutley. He and Sebastian Hartford Davis wrote a memorandum in, I think it was 2015, the first one, saying for the first time, we think that the duty of care encapsulates climate change and that directors that don't give adequate consideration to it, that's a foreseeable risk for the company, and if loss ensues, they can be personally liable for breach of directors' duties. They subsequently released two further memoranda, and they basically said it in even stronger terms. And they said that the directors that will be most likely to be hit with actions for breach of duty for this will be those that engage in greenwashing. So no surprises there. But the thing about Australia that is unusual compared to a lot of other jurisdictions in Asia is that we have a predominantly public enforcement regime for directors' duties, where our business conduct regulator, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, or ASIC, is the one that brings most of the breach of directors' duties actions. We have derivative suits that shareholders can bring under the Corporations Act, and it's not that hard to bring them if you get, caught imprimatur. But shareholders very rarely, bring those directors' duties actions. And that's the same in the UK. You've got loser pays rules that you don't have in the US. There are lots of disincentives for shareholders suing. Where shareholders are suing now in Australia is in class actions, which were introduced, I think, about 2 decades ago, or maybe a bit more now. And they're, quite active way for shareholders to bring actions. In relation to the disclosure point, yes, I agree that will sort of be a public enforcement, and, misleading and deceptive disclosures will, potentially ground actions. One of the things I found interesting recently is Umakanth, in another project that he's doing, is looking at shareholder inspection rights of corporate documents. And I found it quite interesting that in 2021, shareholders in a major Australian bank successfully sought access to the bank's non-public records to try to determine whether the bank's, significant oil and gas projects were consistent with its sustainable lending policies. Now, a decade ago, I would have thought shareholders wouldn't succeed in an action like that on the basis that, to have those sorts of inspections, it has to relate to them in their capacity as shareholder. But that shows you how things that were previously thought of as like CSR and non-financial risks are now thought of as ESG, central financial risks, and things that shareholders can be seeking access to documents. So I think there'll be a lot of digging of our companies engaging in greenwashing and our companies basically being guilty of corporate hypocrisy here.
So one issue which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, which I just would like to raise briefly, is if we talk about fiduciary duties and disclosure as two of the tools, and Umakanth has made the point that some developing countries will take longer to utilize those tools effectively. How about China? They seem to be going on a little different path in terms of, rather than bottom up, to some extent market-oriented ESG and disclosure, they seem to be more top-down, politically oriented or government policy oriented activities. We do have an essay on the website from our colleague Jiangyu Wang, which compares, Jennifer mentioned CSR, kind of the older formulation of the social responsibility of corporations, which if we are going to make a distinction, it would probably be CSR is not directly related to business operations, but just donate philanthropically, donate some money to some good social cause. Whereas ESG, I think, does relate specifically to your own emissions or your own activities. So is that just a different ballgame? I mean, I think I should mention in passing, I don't know if anyone noticed, so we have the US, Australia, India, and Japan here. The 4 Quad countries are represented. This is not intended to be an anti-Chinese group by any means, but our colleagues from China started writing about CSR rather than ESG and government mandates to do more for society, which didn't seem to fit in closely to the conversation that the rest of us were trying to have. So I don't know, I would encourage people to read Zhang Yu's essay, and we asked him to redo it and make a more specific comparison between a CSR and an ESG approach, and he has done so, and I think it's excellent. We do actually have a China expert, Catherine, who isn't scheduled to come join us yet, but maybe we should ask her to step out of her role for 1 minute if she has any comments on the Chinese approach. Catherine?
Thanks, Bruce. Well, I agree with you that Professor Jiangyu Wang's essay is really great and worth reading, but and I haven't, as he has, I haven't taken a close look at ESG reporting in China. But one point that I would maybe just make as a gloss on his essay is that the relationship between business and government in this instance is very typical of the relationship between business and government and when it comes to other matters of, social policy or economic policy. So there is very strong, and this has grown obviously very, very noticeably stronger in the past few years, this strong tendency to push policies down from the top, from government, even with respect to private companies. And of course, obviously, with respect to state-owned companies. And the state remains a very significant shareholder in many companies across the economic landscape. So whether it's trying to address climate issues or whether it's trying to deal with larger problems in the economy like unemployment, companies will be given clear guidance And they often find it in their best interest to try to at least pay lip service, if not more substantially go along with whatever the government policy is. You know, if we're supposed to hire more people, we'll hire them. If it would be beneficial to not lay people off, we won't lay them off, that kind of thing. And so too with ESG and with CSR.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's something we do need to follow in the sense that China is the world's largest emitter, is it not? I think it is.
It is of greenhouse gases at this point, yes. Although China will make the argument that it has only been a significant emitter for a relatively brief period of time.
Right. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, Umakanth.
Yeah, thanks. I think thanks, Catherine. Your remarks and Professor Wang's essay kind of bring out an important point. It's in the Chinese context, but I think it has more universal application, at least in other jurisdictions in Asia. And what is interesting, and I'm just throwing this out as a question because earlier, until a few years ago, the debate was essentially surrounding CSR. So a lot of these issues would have been talked under the umbrella of CSR. And though after ESG became a kind of a phenomenon, people are trying to, at least in the scholarship, people are trying to build a distinction between CSR and ESG. And CSR as something that is more top-down, driven by the government. And as Professor Wang's essay suggests, something where the government has a role to play for its own benefit. And he calls it corporate political responsibility, because sometimes the CSR agenda can be used by the governments for their own benefits, as, in a sense, like promotion of their own activities and so on. So I think that is something that we see in the Indian context as well. So I didn't speak about this. So India has a provision similar to what China had, but something even more specific, which says 2% of the profits of each company have to be paid towards certain social activities. So that is something where companies directly pay 2% of their profits. It doesn't have to be part of the business activity, but it can go to charity, philanthropy, so on. So that's kind of the CSR. Now I see that debate increasingly, that's going to stay. I suppose that will be there in China, that will be there in India. That's going to be one part of it. But increasingly, I think there's also a focus saying that it's not enough for companies to do that. We need companies to deal with these issues like climate change as part of their regular business activities. And that's where the debate is shifting from CSR to ESG. Maybe it's an artificial distinction, but I think for clarity of understanding, I think I see at least some papers in the Indian context where people are saying we see this shift to ESG, where no matter what the government wants companies to do, companies should be doing more as part of their business activities. And who is driving that? ESG is not driven by the government, essentially, but it's actually by the investors, aided by the government policy. So I think the China example maybe is something that helps us understand this distinction as well, to some extent.
Jennifer.
I think Yumi wanted to say something.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yumi, yes. Go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you. I just want to talk about Chinese green bond market led by the state, because I find some interesting analysis that shows that the green bond with third-party certification by Chinese government have lower issue rate than straight bond. So that means that Chinese government put the third-party certification on their green bond. So it means someone said that the Chinese green bond, some doubt Chinese green bond that meet global standard in the definition of green. That means maybe half of the Chinese green bond can be washing, we can say that. So, but anyway, the government, even the capital market, the green bond. So it's a ESG, even in ESG, the Chinese government lead. I think that's it. Thank you.
Well,
I was just going to say, Bruce, in relation to China, I thought Zhang Yiwang's paper was fabulous. It was so interesting to me. And I think one of the things that I found most interesting was the way he talked about, it's being used as a form of political survival, the CSR. And that means that in the Chinese context, the goals can really shift depending on what the Chinese government government views as important for its political survival. When we're discussing ESG, I think it's rather different. We all have a view of what we want to reach. It's just there are so many different ways. How do we reach it? How do we attain those goals? But I think from his essay, you see that the goals can shift considerably depending on what the Chinese government views as being in its interests at any moment. And I think that shows a real tension that we'll see going forward between, the desire for ESG and the desire, for example, to ESG security, energy security in a world where the geopolitical, stresses and strains are immense. And, Ukraine's an example of that.
Well, so that raises a whole nother set of issues, which we'll talk about for a few minutes and then go to the Q&A. So we have Ukraine, we have the price of energy going up, we have new issues about energy security. At the same time, there was an article in Bloomberg, was it this morning, that there were much discussion of climate financing and not financing coal-powered plants, starting with the Paris Agreement in 2015. But in fact, coal-related financing has made a comeback, not just very recently, but over the years, and that perhaps not everyone has lived up fully to what the discussion was about limiting that kind of finance. And generally, aren't Asian countries more exposed to fossil fuel emissions than the EU and the US? Is there any way out of that? And Yumi showed us a chart, and I think things are moving. I think in Japan, they did double their renewable energy capability in the last decade and plan to double it again, but still not nearly enough, I suppose. Nuclear power, I don't know. Is dependence on fossil fuel going to make it more difficult for Asian countries to keep up or catch up with what's going on in the EU and the US? How do we deal with them and financing of those kinds of plants?
Well, yeah.
Yes.
I think that the Asian countries depend on much fossil fuel still. So we have to make an innovation for renewable energy. But as to Japan, we have Japan is big earthquake in 2011. So we are reluctant to have a nuclear power, and we don't have much land for the windmill. So and the finance part, we don't have a stream of money to the seed and early venture capital in Japan. That's a problem because Japanese institutional investors don't take much risk to invest in venture capital. So they said they have a fiduciary duty. So the Japanese people are not take risk generally. So I think the challenge to make a stream of money to venture capital. So that's it.
Okay, so we need more resources for investment in renewable energy. One last point on Ukraine, then we'll wrap up this portion. One thing that interested me greatly was discussion of Russian companies and bonds no longer being investable. Now, in the past, we've had movements with respect to investments from South Africa during apartheid, that everything should be divested because those governments are objectionable. And whether it's the same argument or a new one, I've certainly been reading about how now ESG asset managers, some are saying, from an ESG perspective, we should not invest in Russian companies. Now, I thought traditionally, at least, that ESG would focus on, for example, the actual emissions of the individual company, and not the governmental structure that company's activities was in some sense indirectly supporting. But now we do start hearing about people citing ESG considerations in a different way, that we shouldn't be investing in those companies. If that's true for Russia, the last week or two, I've also heard people, without any big movement resulting from it, but hearing people starting to worry about companies in China. Chinese companies listed in the US are down over 50%. Some managers are starting to get nervous about that because obviously China's share of the market and impact will be many, many times larger than Russia's would be. Does that make any sense to you as sort of an application of ESG principles? Or are we mixing up things that don't belong together?
Well,
oh, I'm
yeah.
sorry. You
Yumi,
go ahead.
it's okay, it's okay. Go first, please.
Okay, thanks. So thanks, Bruce. You know, to me, I think the Ukraine situation and ESG seems to be pretty complex. And somehow I'm not able to get a very clear signal as to where things are going to move. So for instance, I'll just give you a couple of examples. You know, there is a sense when you read the popular and the financial press that there could be some reversion towards like non-renewable energy because of, you know, what's happening with Russia and the concerns that, you know, there could be energy security issues. So is there a reversal from ESG to that extent? I think that's one question. Although I think people are trying to rationalize it by saying there could be a short-term reversion away from ESG, but in the long term, I think people are going to look at renewable energy. So there's a short-term and long-term kind of issue. The second thing, which also I found a little intriguing, is I don't recall who the investor is, but one of the investors who had kind of followed the principle of investing in only particular kinds of industries has now re-looked at the investment strategy into the defense industry. So I think there's a sense that defense is going to become big again, given that, you know, this has now come into the limelight. So nobody thought anything like this could happen, and it's happened in 80 years later. And I think that's so to me, it seems that that's a little peculiar, because while there's a sense that you need to invest in certain types of industries, but people are saying, no, this is kind of a shock event or a black swan event, which we need to relook at. And the third point, I think, is investing in Russian bonds, or even in companies which have something to do with Russia. There's the famous Yale professors list, Sonnenfeld's list about, you know, which are the companies that have not fully into India, and there's a grade into Russia. There's a grade A to E in those companies. So if you're an investor, is that going to be like an index for you to think about investing? I think these are issues. So the bottom line to me is, I think there's layers and layers of questions that come out on Ukraine, but I find it difficult to kind of point to things that are moving in a particular direction, because I think the issue seems to have given rise to a lot of complexity.
Thank you. Yeah, short-term versus long-term effects, we'll have to stay tuned. That was Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, in his letter to shareholders last week, said in the short term, fossil fuels will increase, but that will only further longer-term pressure to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. I think we've already gone a little bit longer than we wanted to. Catherine, can we have some questions from the audience?
We have some, yes. I'll sort of take them in chronological order. So going back to the beginning of the discussion, the panelists were discussing this question of which countries are out in front, which countries are laggards. Is Asia a laggard? And it was generally agreed that the EU, Europe, is in the lead. And the question being asked is, where does Asia compare against, say, the United States? Because I think in the United States, we don't see ourselves as being very advanced in respect to addressing climate change. But how would the US compare with Japan, India, Australia? And I'd like to add to that a question of whether there is a leader within Asia that we can look to as being in the forefront.
I think that's a difficult question. It depends what standard you use to measure progress. So my recollection is that if you looked at ESG assets, and again, they're not well defined, so having the most ESG assets does not necessarily mean that investment is going into renewable energy, whatever. I think Australia has the highest percentage of ESG assets, even higher than the US. I think Japan has the highest volume of ESG assets. We talked about disclosure requirements. So what does everyone think, comparing Asia to the US?
Well, Bruce, I think one thing that lies beneath it all is how seriously does the population take climate change? And I think in the US under the Trump years, the population was told this is, not a real problem. In Australia, it's been such a hot political issue, just a hot potato for politicians for forever. We lost 2 prime ministers basically because they wanted to put in reforms relating to climate change and they were forced out of office. So it's been a hugely hot political issue in Australia. But we've had terrible bushfires. We're currently having shocking floods in Australia. And I think the whole shift in the sense of the populace is, no, this thing is real. And, we really have to deal with it. And so, yeah, still grappling with what are the best ways of dealing with it. But I think it's critical that your underlying population views it as a problem and that there is pressure on companies to also view it as a problem.
Right. Anyone else? Well, I think your point is well taken. We've certainly had similar issues in the US. When people ask me, is climate change real? Very few people ask that these days. But when they do, my favorite example is the large Northern California utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, which essentially went bankrupt because the hot winds from Mexico started going farther north in California, and they were not prepared to protect their power lines. There were trees nearby, they weren't insulated properly, and that company went bankrupt. It was a major utility. So I think our understanding of that this is real has been increasing. In the US to date, I would say the government is trying to do things, but has not been able to yet adopt strong policies. And in fact, as I mentioned at the outset, whether for better or worse, it's really been up to institutional investors to put lots of pressure on companies through accumulating ESG funds and investing them. And that has been, if you just look at the assets, that's been highly successful. The ultimate impact and effect, I think we still have to be watching to see what happens and whether or not we should rely so heavily on that as an approach, I think is an open question. We've all said that's one of our tools.
Yeah. So Bruce, following up on what you just said about ESG assets and using that as a measuring stick for progress, are there any studies that have been done to sort of look into the veracity of identifying assets as ESG or environmentally friendly or sustainable or the like, or do we just take that on trust that it says that on the label? How much can we trust those labels?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the answer is probably not as much as we would like to. There are certainly examples. I'm not sure if any study has reached a clear conclusion in direct answer to your question, but there are certainly many examples and studies which show that if you look at the actual shareholdings, stock holdings of funds which label themselves as ESG, in at least some cases, they are not substantially different from broader index funds or the general market. And as Umakanth mentioned, these things change. Whereas many ESG funds would not invest in defense companies, now defense companies are good because of Ukraine. I think the question of not having clear definitions, both for asset managers and also all these consulting companies that give out ESG scores and grade corporations, there's no standard for that either. Each grader's criteria are different. That makes it very difficult for the companies, and you can end up with horror stories like companies in Japan who get questionnaires from ESG asset managers that ask things like, what is your policy towards gun control? Well, the answer is there are no guns in our country, so we don't have a policy towards gun control. But if you say, well, this doesn't affect us, and you don't answer it, then you get a bad score. So I think there's, I'm aware of at least some examples where companies feel obliged to hire consulting firms to help them fill out the questionnaires, which are not put together very well, to avoid getting bad ESG scores. And the consulting firms that offer their advice are often the same companies that make the grades in the first place. So their potential conflict of interest very similar to the credit rating agencies rating bonds. We make the decision, and by the way, we'll help you get a good rating if you pay us more or separately. So I think there's a lot of criticism despite the overall good intentions. And I think it's not easy to sort all that out. I'm sorry, Umakanth?
Yeah, so just to add, Bruce, there's one interesting development in the Indian context where the securities regulator in January has put out a consultation paper actually wanting to regulate these ESG rating service providers. So that, there's some control on conflict of interest, accreditation. So they want to actually have some supervision and oversight over those ESG raters, maybe similar to credit rating agencies.
Well, that would be a very interesting development, but the SEC was unsuccessful. After the financial crisis back around 2010, the SEC made a pretty serious effort to try to set up an independent panel that would randomly, I guess, assign bond rating assignments to different credit rating agencies to completely remove the conflict of interest. And it was seen as being kind of too much, too bureaucratic, and the several-year effort ultimately failed. So I think that sounds wonderful in theory, and I hope they're successful. But I think some experience to date would make me wonder a bit how that will work out in the end.
One thing I just want to say about ESG washing, and there are many ESG funds which do not invest in green. So Japanese government agency, FSA, and Tokyo Stock Exchange will have the monitoring system to that such an ESG fund. So right now they are thinking about that in Japan. That's it.
Okay.
Bruce, just when you were talking about the difficulties that the SEC has had, I do wonder whether the US might be somewhat idiosyncratic in the way that it splits corporate law, a la Delaware, and securities law being federal law. And, because there is always this tremendous backlash if there's a perception that the SEC or federal law is invading the realm of corporate law, which should be state-based in the US, whereas many other countries in Asia would not have that division, including Australia. I think some countries in Asia, maybe South Korea might have it, but I think many countries in UK, Australia, and other countries in Asia don't have that split securities law, corporate law.
A fair point. Catherine, do you have any other questions for us, or shall we proceed?
No, I have a question. It's about investments, offshore investments into China. So can anyone comment on how international funds in your area or in your jurisdiction, I think he means, are dealing with ESG and climate risk with respect to investments in China? Are local regulations or shareholder initiatives, institutional investors, how do local regulations or shareholder initiatives affect such investments?
Good question. None of us are exactly China experts. I'll just go back to what I mentioned before, that I think, in generally speaking, the foreign investment into China has fallen precipitously in recent months. largely because of fears generated by Ukraine, and then underlying issues of audit issues with the SEC or the PCAOB under the SEC, that even if people are listed in the US, that the SEC can't get access to the audit information. And that certainly would affect the largest Chinese companies.
I think the issue here may be the distinction between the companies. If a Chinese company were listed on a Singapore market, Sydney market, New York market, then of course they would be subject to the reporting disclosure requirements of those markets, and they would be directly affected by whatever the local rules were. But what is it's a kind of an arm's length situation when you have a fund that is managed offshore in your jurisdiction, and that fund has investments into China. I think that is where the question comes in. Do the various regulations with respect to disclosure apply to these investment funds? I think that's the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Apply to investment funds themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at least in the jurisdictions that I'm somewhat familiar with, which is India and Singapore, I don't think there's anything specifically focused on investments to be made in China. So I guess it would depend on the individual policies of the investment funds which are located here. So I don't think there's a government regulation. It might just depend on internal policies of the funds.
We need Zhengyi Wang here to tell us about Chinese investment. That's what we need.
Yeah. Have there been any studies done with respect to analyzing the disclosures that are being made pursuant to these new disclosure requirements? What is the quality, what is the specificity and the accuracy, or what is known about those aspects of the disclosures that are made by companies? Or is it too soon to know?
I think just to, in many jurisdictions where TCFD is just about being mandated or is being introduced, I think it's too soon to know. But I think the general complaints about disclosures are, firstly, there's a concern that a lot of it is actually boilerplate, which is, the problem with any kind of disclosure, more so here. And there's a risk that positive information is embellished, whereas negative information is hidden, kind of a thing. And the third issue is comparability, which we've already discussed, which will get addressed by TCFD, but it doesn't look like TCFD is, even within many of the Asian jurisdictions, there's no sense, only some are adopting TCFD, others are not. So I think even if we were to take, ascribe some level of homogeneity to Asia, I don't think we're going to have one type of situation, and that's going to be one problem as well.
Yes, another example of diversity, which we frequently encounter. Okay, shall I continue then?
Yes.
Okay, so we're getting towards the end, and I think the question on many people's minds is, if they read the essays or they listen to your presentations, they get the impression of a lot of movement forward. Both in terms of information disclosure, becoming more important and moving towards mandatory requirements, I think everywhere, but certainly in Asia as well, as a general direction. At the same time, we've had discussions of duty of care, fiduciary duties, investments, ESG funds. It all sounds quite positive. But then at the same time, if you look at the UN reports, the most recent report from the IPCC, it seems like we're fighting all these good little actions, but losing the overall war. Despite everything that's going on, is it making enough difference in allowing us to move forward quickly enough toward achievement of the goals that we set forth for ourselves, both sort of internationally and for specific countries? So what would you say to someone who said, it all sounds wonderful, but at the end of the day, is it enough? Do we need to do more? How much have we done? What do we need to do better or faster? How would you respond to that?
Okay, Bruce, here's my tuppence worth. I would say until executive remuneration changes, until it's not all about financial results, nothing will change. So it's great to have aspirations in codes. It's great to have aspirations, you know, in institutional investor pressure. But until the rubber hits the road in terms of how executives are remunerated, that's where the incentives will be really critical. So I think that's one thing that needs to be changed. I also wonder whether, you know, something that came out of the global financial crisis was this greater reliance on supranational regulation rather than just national regulation. And of course, you know, the EU is a kind of juggernaut in that regard, but just in that localized area of Europe. I do wonder whether we need much better guidance from supranational organizations. And of course, you know, we're starting to get that, but we just have to get harmonization of what everyone wants. And for that to then, you know, filter down into national regulation where national regulators can sort of enforce, you know, like in Australia, breach of directors' duties or whatever, but the supranational regulators are doing something differently. And that really did come out of the global financial crisis.
Right, good points. Anyone else would care to comment? Where do you think we're at?
Yeah, so just to add to what Jennifer said, I think the points that she made are very important ones, like ingraining climate issues into the whole DNA of the system, of the corporate system. And as Jennifer said, maybe the incentives of the managers. So a couple of other things that I can think of is, for example, after the global financial crisis in the financial sector, there was a lot of emphasis on compliance, because there was a fear that people will actually go to jail if a financial institution or a bank were to breach any of these rules. So consistent with the supranational regulation that Jennifer mentioned, maybe we need to have better compliance systems within companies. Like what some of the activist shareholders have been asking companies like Shell to do, which is have more environmental experts and climate change experts on your boards. So maybe some of it may be symbolic, but at least these things will get discussed in the boardrooms more specifically than otherwise. So I guess there needs to be more specific operational changes to deal with these. And there could be many, many more such things. I think that's really where, as Jennifer said, the rubber will meet the road.
Okay, so we need a broader effort in many areas, in many specific areas, to incorporate climate change issues into corporate frameworks and decision making. Okay, Yumi?
Metrics.
Okay, yeah, so far I think we are moving toward green rapidly, but my concern is that the investment is concentrated in the company in developed countries with high ESG scores. So it does not flow our emerging market. So as a result, emerging economy may fall behind in the area of shifting green. So maybe ESG bias that the high score in the developed companies. So it may create inequality. So ESG with green high score and may cause human rights problem developing country. That's my concern.
Okay, so companies from developing countries may not have enough budget to hire all the consultants to help them with their ESG questionnaires. That's a big problem. Well, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but yes, thank you for mentioning that. So we're down to the end here. Does anyone have any final words? It seems like we're doing more and more, but someone keeps moving the goalpost further away from us. Remember, at the UN as well, IPCC reports seem to be saying that climate change risks are worse than we thought just a few years ago. So maybe that's part of the background for people not having a clear idea of sort of the progress we're making and whether it's enough. Are people optimistic or pessimistic going forward? Does anyone want to venture an opinion?
Cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
I just think we will see a lot of tension between the goals that we've set ourselves with ESG. And as you say, the risks there are greater than we appear to have even, in our worst nightmares envisaged. But the geopolitical risks that we're starting to see are also worse than we could have envisaged. And so I think there will be tensions in that regard, tensions between environmental matters and social matters, such as Yumi mentioned, the fact that Asia being a powerhouse has lifted many people out of poverty. People will possibly go back into poverty. So there will be, it's a very volatile situation, I think.
Right.
Yes, well, I'm basically optimistic, but as Jennifer mentioned, I'm very much concerned that the weapons are good for the protection of democracy. So some investors say that. So we have to concern about that.
Right. Well, I think we've reached our time limit. I wanted to thank everyone for an excellent and enjoyable conversation about a broad range of issues that we should all be concerned with in Asia. Catherine, would you like a final word here?
I'll simply add my thanks to all of the speakers for their participation in what was a really fascinating discussion. And thank you, Bruce, for helming the discussion so well. And thank you and good night to our audience. Hope to see you back in a week.